Hello and welcome to Voices of the Industry, a podcast series bringing you leading industry voices who challenge thinking across transportation, infrastructure and cities.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thanks for tuning into Steer's latest podcast episode. And today we're going to be discussing local area energy plans, or LAEPs, which are rapidly gaining traction as a way for local authorities to understand and take action on the opportunities for decarbonisation in their local areas. And LAEPs are data-driven, bottom-up approaches which allow authorities to map their energy use across their local area and to then create a bespoke roadmap to net zero that covers all aspects of energy, from buildings, transport and local industry, and helps to really get under the skin of the local needs and challenges within their local area. I'm Nicola Kane. I'm a director in Steer's Manchester office, and prior to joining Steer, I was head of strategic planning at Transport for Greater Manchester and responsible for leading Greater Manchester's long-term transport strategy development. And so I know all too well that developing great plans and strategies is one thing, putting them into action is another. And so I'm delighted to be joined today by Mark Atherton, who's Director of Environment at Greater Manchester Combined Authority and has really been a pioneer in the use of local area energy plans. And Mark and I used to work quite closely together when I was at TFGM. So yeah, it's great to have you here today, Mark. Thank you for joining us and taking the time out of your busy schedule.
Good to be here and good to see you again.
So I guess just to kind of introduce a bit about you and your role, do you want to just say a few words about your role and maybe just highlight something you're particularly proud of that you've worked on since joining the Combined Authority?
Sure. So my role as Director of Environment at the Combined Authority is really to work on behalf of the Mayor, bringing together the 10 local authorities to look at how we deliver the Greater Manchester 5-year Environment Plan, which was launched in 2019. And I very much frame it as how the Combined Authority works as one of the 10 local authorities to support those 10 local authorities to deliver their ambitions for net zero. Most of them have delivered quite a lot already in the last few years. They've all declared a climate emergency and most of them biodiversity emergency as well. So if you're asking what am I most proud of, I think I've probably got to be a little bit humble and say it's not really about me. It's about the people I work with, both the people in the districts and the people in my teams, who I think have really tried to understand how we can accelerate from where we are now to carbon neutral by 2038, which is the Greater Manchester ambition. And I think we've put a lot of good building blocks in place and we are getting to that space where we're ready to accelerate. I'll say more about that a little bit later. So if there was one thing, I think it's about capacity, actually. When I first came into the role, the amount of resource that we had to put into tackling climate change was at the CA level was relatively low. And over the last 5 years, bidding for successful projects and winning bids, we've built that capacity up so that we have more people, more technical detail and more capacity to be able to support those districts to do more.
Brilliant. And it'd be good to come back and talk a little bit about maybe some of that sort of joined up strategic planning, because I know that's an area that Greater Manchester again has really been leading the way on. So perhaps we can touch back on that later in the conversation.
Sure.
Great. Thank you for joining us, Mark. Also with us today is Shivali Mathur from Amberside Advisors, which is part of the Steer Group. And Shivali joined Amberside at the end of last year and was previously in the Project Management Office of the Department of Energy, Security and Net Zero, or DESNZ, as we like to call it. She's fresh from hosting our panel of experts at the Unlocking Decarbonisation event, which Steer ran at UK Reef. So thank you for hosting that, Shivali. It was a really good event. Do you want to tell us a little bit about you and also any sort of key takeaways that you took from that decarbonisation panel that we ran?
Thanks, Nicola. To be honest, on the UK Reef event, which happened a couple of weeks ago, one thing which it highlighted for me was the importance of collaboration. I think Mark mentioned about the teams, and there is a whole, I think, emphasis on how public and private sectors need to work together, not only to bring in investment, but to share best practices and plan for net zero, the strategic planning part, as you said. So there was a whole theme running across different pavilions in UK Reef. It also provided some insights on how can we accelerate decarbonisation at pace and scale. I think that deadline for our targets is not that far off now. And for me, Greater Manchester is one of the really good examples in how to foster strategic partnerships, which was also another theme of UK Reef. Another one for Steer and Amberside I felt was market intelligence. Apart from networking, there was a great emphasis on diversity and inclusion, which personally I do believe has a great impact on systems resilience. And if I'm honest, today I'm really honored to be here with Mark. My journey started off at GMCA back in 2010 or 11 when we did the NEDO project. That was the first time I saw the power of collaboration between combined authority, local authorities. There were 3 local authorities working on it, on social housing project, and DNO. The DNO was involved and was a major stakeholder at the time. So my first smart city project.
Brilliant. Well, it'd be great to maybe hear a bit more about that project through the conversation as well, Shivali. I think that was slightly before my time. So yeah, I'd be fascinated to hear a bit more about how that went. So let's kind of go back to basics, maybe for people who aren't familiar with the local area energy planning process. Mark, do you want to just kind of briefly explain what is a LAEP and how does it work?
Sure. So as you said at the top of the programme, LAEPs are data-driven spatial collaborative planning tools to help unlock investment. And in our terms, what they really do is look at where we are now in terms of transport, built infrastructure and energy infrastructure, and look at where we need to be to get to carbon neutral by 2038. And they help us to plot a course between now and our goal. It's a 7-step process. First of all, you identify and engage your stakeholders. Then you look at setting an area vision. So for us, carbon neutral 2038, our objectives and targets. You create an understanding of the local area energy system by looking at data and engaging with your partners. You investigate what the future local energy scenarios might look like, produce a local energy strategy, and then you test it, lead some of the implementation, monitor, review it, and then you start all over again.
Brilliant. So where are you now in that process in GM, and are they starting to actually deliver on the ground yet?
Yeah, so we produced our LAEPs about 2 years ago now. We have one for each district in Greater Manchester, and we have Greater Manchester Plan, which sums the 10 districts. And all of them have started delivering. We have programs of activity looking at how we retrofit domestic properties, retrofit public buildings, look at how we install electric vehicle charging infrastructure, look at generating energy locally where we can make that work, and look at things like heat networks, which are a little bit longer term but more strategic, but highly important. And the idea behind the local energy plans is to almost understand how you can create a system, a multi-vector approach, which foresees how energy might be both used and generated in the future, and how you can bring those two things together efficiently and effectively. And by that I mean the real purpose is to try and not leave ourselves without any white elephants, any stranded assets. So what we're trying to do is almost predict the future. Now, the energy system is moving so quickly. Almost weekly, there's something that changes in the energy system in the UK. So it's very difficult to predict more than a few years out. And that's where the LAEPs come into their own, because what they allow you to do is plan for the immediate, almost the no-regret actions. And you can start working on those so that you don't inadvertently invest in something that you might have been better leaving to a future date. And all 10 districts in Greater Manchester are delivering on those plans. And we're making good progress. We're still a long way away from our target. I'm not gonna lie, a long way to go. But we've laid a really firm foundation, and now I hope we'll be able to accelerate from here.
That's brilliant. And were there any kind of big new insights which came out of all that kind of data analysis and engagement that you did?
Yeah, the scale of the challenge was probably the biggest insight, because we knew it was going to be difficult. But what the LAEP process told us was that within the next 5 years, we need to try and retrofit something like 140,000 homes. We need to look at how we can generate nearly 2 gigawatts of renewable energy. We need to find enough charging infrastructure to support the implementation of nearly 200,000 electric vehicles on our roads. And we need to think about how we develop heat networks that could support 8,000 homes and 116,000 heat pumps. So there are big challenges and big delivery challenges over the next 5 years if we're going to try and keep on track to be carbon neutral by 2038. So the scale of the challenge came home to us, because to put that into context, even with the work that we're doing at the moment, we're probably retrofitting or supporting the retrofit of around 7,000 homes a year. That's a long way away from what we need to, which is nearly 60,000 a year, really. However, I'm only counting in that the ones that we are involved in from a local authority perspective. Obviously, householders all over the conurbation are investing in their own property, and it doesn't include those numbers. So we need to add those into the 140,000 target.
Great. Shivali, I suppose you've been working at national levels through your previous role. What's your perspective on how, I suppose, the role of national government in kind of supporting this acceleration towards net zero and decarbonisation?
I think GM contributes to 3% from heat perspective, so it's one of the biggest cities in that realms, and then Bristol is another one. The whole idea of LAEPs being data-driven, spatially, I think that's a good starting point, put into a zoning methodology software, and then it goes into refinement from towns and cities perspective, and then drill down. I think policies, regulations, the support coming from the central government is helpful for the combined authorities and local authorities. On skills supply chain, so a lot of emphasis recently from BSDS perspective, and also skills development has been from DESNES as well, some schemes. But locally, I've seen there has been, and especially working with Greater Manchester from years ago, a lot of emphasis on how can the skills and supply chain be built in the regions itself. How can the 10 local authorities or districts upskill their own contractors to be able to deliver and look after the heat pumps in future? So I think national level and local level almost needs to work in tandem for the wider outcomes.
That's great. And do you want to talk a bit more about that social housing case study? Because that sounds really interesting.
Oh, the Nedo case study. Yeah, I think that was the first smart city project, Mark, in the country. I would say the aggregation of 550 heat pumps. Greater Manchester was bold enough to put their 3 councils in front and get the funding from Ministry of Japan. And in the first, I think it was first time ever, even from a heat pump manufacturer perspective, we had seen aggregation at that level from social housing perspective. Catapult were indirectly, or ETI at the time, were involved. And it was the challenges which we saw were quite unique at the time. Community engagement, first of all, even to get a free heat pump in a property was a challenge to explain how it would work. The whole concept of low temperature radiators and the radiators not being super hot at 70 degrees was another challenge. But I think working together, one of the learnings was working together with the councils for a manufacturer and for delivery contractors was key. One of the key learnings we saw from that project. So I think now that has become a gospel that everyone should involve communities. Second one was DNOs. So I remember that case of, and Mark might be able to say that in details because I just attended one meeting on that one, was sheltered housing. The project was also almost going to stop at that point because DNOs mentioned about the constraint network, and we had to find out other ways of doing so. Maybe, Mark, you can expand a little bit on Nedo project.
Yeah, so we were fortunate to get investment from the new energy demonstration organisation of Japan, which, as Shivali says, is part of the Japanese government, to the tune of about 30 million. And the programme lasted about 4 years, I think, eventually. It just kept going. And the whole purpose was to test the idea that you could shift demand for energy away from the peak times. So it was really about how do you unlock some of the constraints in the energy grid, by which I mean the electricity grid in particular has peak times in the morning and peak times in the evening. And in between those peak times, the demand for electricity is relatively low. So what we need to do as a society is either increase the capacity of the grid, which is incredibly expensive, or we need to shave the peaks off those peak times and smooth them out a little bit. So we allow the existing capacity to be more spread over the dial period of the day. And that's really what the Nedo project was about. It's about how do you get 550 heat pumps working in social homes across Greater Manchester to store heat at times when the demand on the grid was low, and utilise that heat in the home when the demand on the grid was high. So you're taking demand off the grid. And it worked very well, but as Shivali correctly said, we probably learnt more about citizen and community engagement and what it takes to take people on the journey to explain what a heat pump is. And not just that, but you have to try and understand what demand side response is. And what we found was actually the residents that just took the technology and let it be set up for them and let it run were highly satisfied. The satisfaction rating was like 70-80% or more. But of course, with any new technology, some people like to play with it a little bit. And what we found was we'd set up the system so it would work at its optimal temperature or its optimal range. And then the resident would play with it a little bit, or we had cases where some wires became dislodged and that stopped talking to the internet. And there were all sorts of technical issues which we learned from. And it's absolutely right. You have to take your communities with you on the journey and explain step by step what the technology is, how they benefit from it, what other values they will get from it, a warm, comfortable home with lower heating bills, but also it's almost like a plug and play. You can almost let it take care of itself with a smart meter inside. And it was, I think, valued as a good learning experience as well as being a successful project for the residents that benefit from the technology.
Nicola, can I just also link this to your first question on the local area plans? And it would be really interesting to hear from Mark on that side. Completely agree on the 7-stage process, Mark, and I think Catapult's defined those processes quite nicely and neatly. Where I feel, and this is probably a personal opinion, on the LAEPs, there is a gap on delivery and also being slightly static. Yes, they give the immediate actions from no regret options perspective, but that part of community engagement, the place-based solutions, from the whole behavior change perspective on how do we bring in that, and especially the complex challenge of combined authority where 10 districts or 10 local authorities have to be brought together from their diverse approaches. Do you think does a LAEP would work for others? So I think GM has done it in a very different way and successfully. But for others nationally, do you think that could work?
I see no reason why not. I think you're right to point out the complexities of working across 10 local areas, but we work very closely with those areas in Greater Manchester, and you also benefit from the interaction between the districts talking to each other about their challenges and their successes. So they learn from each other, but they also share each other's burdens when things don't go as well or as planned. So I think what the LAEP process does is give you a common understanding of the energy system across 10 districts. It puts it all on the same plane, so you can understand how your district varies from a different district next, maybe a neighbouring district. And also what it helps you to do is look at the interrelationships between those districts. So if we want to take forward a large retrofit program, let's say, if we do it across 10 districts, we can get economies of scale. We can look at demand. We can look at aggregation of procurement of those technologies to hopefully reduce the cost. You can look at the different ways that you can engage your citizens and learning from what other people have done, what's been more successful, what's been less successful. So I would probably advocate LAEPs being shared across a wider geography than just one local authority area. But I see no reason why they wouldn't work in every local authority. I think they probably will work better in urban locations, perhaps over rural, because I think rural local authorities have different and in some ways more challenging aspects to decarbonise. In urban conurbation, where you've got high concentrations of people and high concentrations of energy use, whilst the scale of your challenge is bigger, you have everything that you need to be able to bring the solution in one place. So really, it's just about convincing people to go on that journey with you.
So just thinking a little bit about that kind of joined up planning. And again, this is, something that Greater Manchester's really led the way on. Do you want to talk a bit, Mark, about some of the strategic planning that's been going on around infrastructure more generally, perhaps work on Places for Everyone plan, which covers all aspects of planning, and maybe some of the structures you've put in place to help improve collaboration between the different stakeholders that will actually be responsible for delivering all of this new infrastructure and working towards net zero?
Yeah, sure. So Places for Everyone is the name of the spatial plan that has just been approved that covers 9 of the 10 districts. Stockport decided to go do their own thing. And as you say, it's a planning tool that covers not just energy, but the wider planning system. And that gives us a good framework, again, for embedding some of the LAEP proposals into a wider planning policy framework. What it also does is give us a common base from which we can understand how some of the more challenging infrastructure pieces, heat networks, for example, can be quite disruptive within the physical environment. So it helps us to understand how those sorts of disruptions can be minimised or can be done at the same time as other forms of utility development to try and reduce costs, but also reduce disruption to residents. We have a strategic infrastructure board that's been set up for a few years now that includes our DNOs, United Utilities, the water undertaker, some of the regulatory bodies, and obviously the local authorities and GMCA. And that's really there to try and look for synergies to understand how in planned investment over the next plan period, ED period, what each of the utility undertakers is planning to do and whether they can be aligned and whether we can minimise the disruption that might cause. As I said, just to reduce costs where we can, but also to reduce disruption for citizens. I should have mentioned actually that the DNO, our Electricity Northwest is our electricity DNO, have been heavily involved in the development of our local energy plans, as has Cadent, which is our gas DNO, and have been very supportive right from the very beginning. So the very first LAEP that was produced was in Bury, one of our districts, and it was a pilot. And it only looked at heat, and it was part of a program called Smart Systems and Heat, which is funded by BEIS at the time and was led by the Energy Systems Catapult. And it was the forerunner of the LAEP process. It was the test and trial to see how these things worked. And then when we'd completed that piece of work with the DNO, we said, well, this is great, but we can't just look at one vector. It can't just be heat. We've got to look at multi-vectors and multi-infrastructure types, because the interrelationship between transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure, built infrastructure, as we decarbonise, those three infrastructure types become ever more interrelated and ever more complex in how they utilise energy. And so you need to look at each of those three infrastructure types. I'd probably throw natural environment in there as the fourth infrastructure type, which has effect on cooling. The plans allow you to align those and understand how a systemic approach can be adopted.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you, Mark. We've sort of touched a little bit on some of the delivery challenges. I guess one of the big topics at UK REEF was around investment and financing of that energy transition. How do we actually make this happen? And around developing robust business cases and so on. It'd be good to hear from both of you, I guess, in terms of the role of the public and the private sector in investing in some of the things we'll need to actually make this transition happen.
So the other benefit of local area energy plans is that once you've identified your pathway or decided what pathway you're going to go with, it allows you to put a cost on what the transition might look like. Now, in Greater Manchester, if you sum all of our 10 local energy plans together, we estimate through a strategic outline business case that to get from where we are now to carbon neutral by 2038 will cost something like £64 billion. And that sounds like a lot of money, and of course it is a lot of money. But it's important to recognise that 70% of that 64 billion would have been spent anyway under business as usual. So what you're looking at is something like £19 billion increase in the cost, which again is quite substantial. And that can be broken down by about £11 billion operational cost, and the rest is, capital cost is 52 billion and the operational cost is 11 billion. But if you take away the business as usual, then you're left with about 19 billion. Of that 19 billion, we think about 12.5 billion is within the influence of local authorities. And that means that you look at the asset classes that the combined authority and the local authorities have some influence over, which would include things like generation and storage, social housing retrofit, public building retrofit, heat networks, and electric vehicle charging. Those 5 asset classes we don't control or own in many instances, but we have some ability to be able to influence them. And what we're trying to do now, and this is our next step, is work out how we can fund those asset classes by blending public finance that's available. We've been quite successful in getting national government grant with available local public grant, public funding, with then private finance. And we are in the process now over the next 2 years of working with DESNZ as what they call a net zero accelerator. Ourselves and West Midlands Combined Authority are the 2 accelerators or trailblazers that they're working with to understand how we can bring forward billions of pounds worth of projects to be able to take to market and blend that with other forms of finance to create viable and deliverable investments in decarbonising our city region. So LEAPs also allow you to start planning for how you finance some of these transitions.
And presumably they make that investment more credible to people who are looking to come into a city region like Greater Manchester. You've done your homework.
Yes, certainly. And I think also we recognise that the public sector may need to take some of the early risk to encourage the private sector to come through. But we've had some really positive discussions from pension funds and other investment organisations who are genuinely keen to invest in low carbon solutions, but need to be provided with surety that they've got long-term pipeline of projects that are viable, investable, and will create a return. Nobody's going to do it for free, sadly. So we do need to create projects that will generate a return on investment. The benefits of taking local energy plan approach is that different projects will have different return values. By taking them as a bundle or a package, you're able to bring together projects which are highly desirable, but with projects which are perhaps less desirable, and create a blended approach so that what you don't end up with is companies investing in the low-hanging fruit or the prize apples on that low-hanging fruit and leaving the higher-hanging fruit, which nobody wants, which become more difficult to invest in the future. So it's a blended approach to try and bring those projects forward, and that's what we're working on over the next 2 years.
That's great. And there was quite a lot of discussion around project pipelines, investment pipelines, wasn't there, Shivali, at the UK REEF event? I don't know if you've got anything else you want to add to that topic.
I think from private finance perspective, I echo what Mark said, that yes, there are lots of pension funds, infrastructure funds, institutional investors, in fact, even utility companies in this area who would like to invest into similar projects in the asset classes, as Mark mentioned. But these asset classes like heat networks or solar, wind generation, or be public sector buildings and EV charging, as you know, the risk profile is quite different. And it's that next step after LAEPs. So LAEPs, they present data for me at a very high level, but the project origination is often hyper-local. So it's that blend of how do we categorize the risk of a heat network project against a public sector building. I think the risk is pretty much low in a public sector decarb because the political will is there, local will is there, there are probably public funds, and in a heat network there you have different risks involved in it. EV charging is a different risk profile. So it's mapping the risks to the asset classes for the investors and matching it to their appetites. It's almost creation of an investor prospectus, which was again another theme in UK REEF. And there was a question from one of the audience in our own panel where they asked that would it be useful for local authorities to have an investor prospectus ready for the investors, that which asset class provides what sort of a return and what risk level. So it's easier for them to just choose. And we had Andrew Farimon from Aviva Investors as well, with a similar thought process. So really, really keen, I think, to take that next step. And I think Greater Manchester is already looking at testing the assumptions of the strategic OBC and take it to the next level before the DPS is ready on the Net Zero Accelerator. So is that bridging the gap from LAEPs to delivery for the investors?
And I guess one of the other challenges around delivery is how you bring all these different programs of activity together. So you're not digging up the same street, a year apart to put in a heat network or to put in a cycle lane or to install EV chargers or whatever it might be. Have you had any thoughts about that in Greater Manchester in terms of how you bring these different programs of investment that all have to happen probably over the next 5 to 10 years, but delivering those in a kind of integrated way is going to be quite challenging. I don't know how you're thinking about those challenges.
Yeah, we're working quite closely with other utility providers to try and map out what their investment decisions are for the next few years. It's quite difficult to match some of those things up, but it is possible in certain areas because obviously we want to try and reduce the costs and minimise disruption. I think it almost comes down to a project by project basis. And so let's take heat networks, for example. We have 5 heat networks that are approaching detailed design. It's only once those get to the point where you know that they're economically viable that you can start talking to other utility providers about what their cost might be, what the capital works might be involved in bringing those heat networks together, and whether they have similar types of capital works that can be aligned. So you do have to do it almost on a project-by-project basis. At a more strategic level and stepping outside of the sphere of energy, for example, we've developed an integrated water management plan with United Utilities and the Environment Agency that looks at how do we potentially co-invest in areas to both improve water quality but also to reduce the risk of flooding. It's a similar sort of principle that we'll need to adopt for our energy systems as well on a case-by-case basis, I think. I do think that there is more to be done in aligning different types of funding for different types of asset class, by which I mean if we're going to generate more renewable energy in Greater Manchester, the biggest opportunity by far is through solar PV, largely rooftop mounted. And whilst we're doing quite a lot of work in the public sector estate, there's no reason why the private sector estate couldn't also undertake that same sort of activity. So the question in my mind is, well, how can we potentially do that together and aggregate the scale and potentially reduce the cost? So I think there's those sorts of opportunities which we're going to try and explore as well as part of the Net Zero Accelerator over the next few years.
And do you think there's any role that national government can play? This may be a question for both of you, actually, in terms of helping to streamline some of that, because you obviously you'll be getting funding from Department for Transport, from DESNZ, from DLUP. Is there anything more they could do to kind of help make that a bit easier to coordinate?
Well, I agree with Shivali's sentiments earlier. I think that to deliver a low-carbon transition will require national government and local government to work hand in glove. And I think we're starting to get that. So DESNZ and funding the Net Zero Accelerator over the next 2 years, and will work closely with us on the delivery of that accelerator. And what the accelerator will do is look at bundling together projects to take to market. And in that process, we're all hoping to learn from the exercise what works and what doesn't work, and we'll be able to share that experience with other local authorities around the country. So one of the benefits we have in Greater Manchester, and West Midlands are in the same boat, is we also are negotiating a devolution deal with central government, looking at how we can devolve public finances from national government to local and give local government more flexibility and more security over those finances. And in essence, that's the key we need to unlock, the challenge of how do you blend finance, because it's not just low carbon funding which is being devolved, it's also some transport funding, some brownfield land funding, some employment work and skills funding. So you start thinking about how you can bring forward not just low carbon projects, but low carbon projects which interact potentially with the transport system, and how do you create supply chains and bring people into those supply chains so that it's local people undertaking that work that are suitably skilled up to benefit from the green transition and help us towards growing the sector, which will be required to undertake the changes that I mentioned earlier, that the number of houses that need to be retrofit, the number of heat pumps that need to be installed. If we can get people who can go into those good quality jobs to be trained up and deliver those jobs locally, then it isn't just about delivering low carbon, it's about developing a good quality of life and hopefully a good living for the people of Greater Manchester, which has to be a win for everybody. And that helps to bring people with us. If they can see the benefit of transition to low carbon is having on their lives and not just having the benefit on the environment, then they'll be much more accepting of some of the changes that might need to be made.
You asked about the national level, Nicola. So I think I completely echo what Mark said about the role of working together, national and local level. But there's another really, really important stakeholder, the network operators. But there is, I think, and specifically is having lots of discussions internally with Steer transport consultants who have been in the market for more than 20 years. I think there is a lot of learning from local transport plans and RTBs. So there are boundaries that RTBs work on, the regional transport bodies, that could possibly help the RESPs, the new regional energy strategic planners, to at least understand what sort of challenges they have seen. In the end, it's both infrastructure. We're playing with long-term infrastructure, and if we are attracting private sector investment, it's about investing into the pipes under the ground, for example. And the regional transport bodies have a lot of experience from the last 20 years in establishing it. So I think to be able to then fast-track this process, it's almost how do we work together as a system, and probably also bring those consultants on both sides together to create the momentum for happy communities, as Mark said. If people feel that, yes, it's bringing value to them, it's fashionable to drive an EV car, Tesla, but probably not as fashionable to have a heat pump or connected to a heat network. So we probably need to combine the non-fashionable and fashionable items together to make it more valuable.
I was listening to Mark talking about those kind of how you manage those peaks in energy demand, and do you try and increase the capacity just to cater for those peaks? And that's exactly the challenge that we faced. Maybe slightly less so post-COVID, but with transport, and you don't want to have roads that are wide enough just to deal with those peak periods, which are relatively short. So I think we're facing a lot of the same challenges across different sectors, and I think there's lots more that we could do to kind of share tools and techniques and ways of thinking about these challenges and how we tackle them a bit more collaboratively, which is certainly happening in Greater Manchester. I want to come back a little bit and just touch on data, because the LAEPs are very data-driven. I'm guessing there's more data that you would ideally want to have to really improve your understanding of how those systems are working and where the opportunities lay. Can you see any opportunities or any kind of gaps in data, Mark, that you would love to be able to fill, or are there any kind of new data sources which are starting to give you different insights into the challenge? Where are you with data?
So when we developed the LAEPs, it's probably the development phase was nearly 4 years ago now. We had to do quite a lot of research to bring together the best available data that we could get hold of. So we undertook a stock transition modelling of 1.2 million homes using EPC data. For public buildings, we used display energy certificate data. We had a program called Go Neutral, which looked at our public buildings and land and analysed them for the potential for on-site renewables, storage, EV infrastructure, charging. We'd been working with BEIS, as it was DESNZ now, on the heat network development feasibility studies under a program called City Deep Decarbonisation. We'd looked at work that you were probably involved in, Nicola, looking at TFGEM's work and studies on historic analysis of EV infrastructure. We looked at energy network data from the DNOs and GNOs, and we used national data sets. So all of this data needed to be pulled together. And it was one of the more challenging parts of developing their LAEPs. My difficulty, I think, is that even though we've used the best available data, that data is constantly improving. And so my question is, well, how do you keep the LAEPs up to date with the best available data? I think that's a real challenge, not just for Greater Manchester, but for anybody else going down this route. So what we're working on at the moment is trying to understand how we can visualize that data in a different way. How can we keep the data regularly updated rather than just doing another LAEP every 5 years, which is the other way to do it. It's perhaps the traditional way to do it. You put a plan in place and then you do it again in 5 years' time, you see what's changed. What we really want is a live interactive system that you can plug new data in as soon as it becomes available and then utilize that data, not just to visualize what your system change might look like, but also to be able to ask the what if questions. So if we put a heat network over here, what does that mean in terms of our ability to be able to generate heat and utilize heat and maybe expand the heat network into a domestic setting over to the north or to the south? So we're doing a little bit of work with KPMG, looking at how we can visualize the data using a digital twin. It's quite a light touch approach to begin with because we want to see how digital twins really will work and what benefit they can offer to us. But if it's successful, then I think that's something that we might well invest more in because I think it will save us money in the long term. And I think what it will do is give us better information on which to develop policy and make decisions.
That's great. So sort of thinking about much more agile plan making, I guess, and particularly when you've got a finite carbon budget that you're working within, being able to kind of monitor and evaluate that on an ongoing basis, I guess is really critical. Any thoughts from you on data opportunities and challenges, Shivali?
Without mentioning particular schemes that I've worked on, but yes, data has been a challenge, and especially if we look at domestic and non-domestic side. From energy perspective, maybe transport slightly, I think, different, and we can make assumptions. There are places where I think, so we've got this Geospatial Commission, the National Underground Asset Register, which looks around subsurface area. And I think there are still opportunities of combining all those data sets to be able to find value in the system. Also, what we capture through the geostationary satellites. And I think there are a lot of advancements have happened from data collection from space agencies and satellite communications and that sort of an industry sector. But again, we need to do it jointly. And I think there is a whole need of collaborative working across those sectors to, again, share best practice and also understand the value of combining the data. Another aspect, and I think especially looking at some of the project work which we've done recently in Steer, Nicola, I've realized that monitoring and evaluation almost needs to be thought at the time of developing a process like LAEP. Right, this is the baseline. This is where we want to be. But during that process, how am I going to monitor? Am I reaching my wider outcomes? The fuel poverty, if suppose it's going to go down, but then increase because of another factor, how am I measuring it through the actions of progressing from the setting of the goal to reaching of the goal? Air quality, which is almost, I think, everyone's challenge. Skills development, supply chain development, jobs, growth. I think there are those wider outcomes which we all want, but how do we monitor and evaluate it? I think it's part of data for me. So it's not only at the point of collecting the data, but how are we going to be evaluating it almost comes together.
Yeah, and I think that's massively important, isn't it, for making the case for future investment as well. And I guess for persuading the decision makers, the politicians, that this is the right thing to do. And there are lots of wider benefits from these kind of improvements. And I kind of wanted to touch briefly on maybe the political angle, if you're happy to go there, just in terms of how do we sell the benefit, not just of producing these plans, but actually delivering them to our political leaders, whether that's locally or at a national level. It'd be great to hear your thoughts on that.
I think irrespective of the colour of the government of the day, as a country, we have signed up to legally binding targets for carbon. And as part of a global citizen, we have a responsibility, I think, to lead the way. I also think, though, and you'll hear many people say this, that there is a benefit in going first sometimes. I mean, yes, you do trip over things because you won't be doing things for the first time, but you also are right at the forefront of innovation, and you are able to look for ways to do things differently, which other people might benefit from. And that does have an economic benefit, by which I mean you can look for opportunities to reduce the cost or increase the efficiency of a given technology if you take it to a scale that it hasn't done before. Heat pumps are a very good example. We should be seeing, in my view, a reduced cost of heat pumps and an increased efficiency of heat pumps as their uptake increases. That's certainly what we're saying to the manufacturers. That's what they need to produce for us. And that has a benefit in terms of understanding how you can reduce the overall cost and increase the delivery through greater aggregation, but also how do you link together different technologies so that it makes sense to deliver at a local level. So let me give you an example. It's one of my bugbears, so forgive me. If you want to retrofit your home, if you want to make your home zero carbon, I know nothing about your home, Nicola, but let's assume it would probably require you to put insulation in your home. It would probably require you to put a heat pump or change out your heating system for one which is lower carbon. It will probably require you to have some form of smart energy system or management system in your home. And it'll probably require you to have some form of energy generation on your roof if your roof can take it. And each of those technologies exist. So we're not talking about anything that is unicorn land. All of these technologies exist. But for you as a homeowner to put those technologies in place, you'll have to go and negotiate with a whole raft of different suppliers. You'll have to make sure the technologies that you're selecting will talk together. When they do talk together, that they will work with your energy supplier, whoever that is. And I think we need to get an awful lot smarter at that. Now, to be fair, some of the energy companies are already starting to offer this sort of service. But that's where we need to get to. We need to get to the point where having a smart home and having a comfortable home and having an energy efficient home, as Shivali said earlier, becomes something of a status symbol. It's something that people aspire towards, just as many people aspire towards having a conservatory. And that adds value to their property. We need to see this sort of transition to low carbon homes as being something that people aspire to, but also adds value to their property so that when they sell it on, they feel like they're getting their money back, the money they've invested back. And I think that becomes important, but also it helps us to sell this to our politicians, because what you're then saying to the politicians is, well, we're heading towards greater autonomy of energy, creating prosumers, so we're heading towards a just transition. You're reducing the potential energy bills of the most vulnerable citizens we have. You're understanding how you can grow the supply chain so that you can create those good quality jobs that I mentioned earlier. So it becomes not just about doing good for the environment, it comes about creating a new system that supports our economy and creates greater social well-being. What isn't to like about that?
Yeah, I think that's really powerful, isn't it? And it creates people who are more aware of how they're using energy and perhaps more conscious of that. I mean, the one thing I have done is put solar panels on, and it's made me think completely differently about, when I use my appliances, obsessing over whether my batteries filling up and so on. So I have a completely different level of understanding now of how much electricity I'm consuming and what time of day than I would have done previously. So I think all of these things just kind of increase our consciousness about our own personal impact.
I think Mark and you have given beautiful example, and it sums it all. But I'll give a very, very recent example of what happened, and that has sort of stuck with me. So at UK Reef event, I was at the Catapult stand, and I was standing next to Nicole Endiveni, and she was being congratulated. And I congratulated her for same, because she has recently been elected as the Police and Crime Commissioner for Derbyshire. But my instant question to her was, and maybe it's my naivety, that what was her role in UK Reef, where we were all talking about clean energy, decarbonisation as a service, how can we bring scale and pace? And when she answered to me, I think it's all about the narrative. She said she would like investors to think about how they can invest into ESGs and reduce crime by offering more jobs. And my instant question was, yes, that's really good. And I think businesses do want to give jobs and invest into it. But what is in it for them? And it was quite clear that if the investors invest into it and the crime decreases of the area, the property value increases. So it's a direct return. It was so beautiful of the reduction of crime proportional to an investor return, which I hadn't thought about. And it's all about the narrative of how all of us can get value from just doing the right things and doing our bit towards the wider social outcomes.
Brilliant. So yeah, I think that brings home nicely the importance of thinking about these things in a much more integrated and holistic way. Everything that we're doing is interconnected, and that it's so important that we start to develop our plans in that more systems-led way. So I think we're probably coming to the end of our conversation. It's been great to talk to you both. I'm going to slightly put you on the spot with one last question, which would be what would be your top priority for accelerating progress towards decarbonisation? Let's say over the next 12 months, like things that we should be getting on with immediately. Mark, I'm sure you think about this all the time, but what would be top of your list of priorities?
The next 12 months, I think, is all about creating investment cases. So some of the figures I gave you earlier are strategic figures, and they're great. But we need to take those down into outline business cases that we can better understand the financial viability of a package of these schemes, so that we can understand what we can pitch to the market and whether that is going to be attractive to the market. And that will be key for us in the next 12 months. And we are having conversations with investors, and their first question is, well, what does the pipeline look like? And I think whilst we have a developing pipeline, understanding the quantum of that and what the return of that pipeline might be is something that we need to develop over the next 12 months, a better understanding of in the next 12 months or so. So that's my priority.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. Shivali, what would your top priority be?
For the next 12 months, collaboration to bringing effective public-private sector partnerships for the outcome of happy communities. I think that for me, that sums it all, and we'll get the right outcomes, which will hopefully lead to the right outputs and correct inputs.
Brilliant. That's great. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for your time this afternoon. We covered an awful lot of ground there, given me lots of food for thought, and great to hear the latest work in Greater Manchester, how that's progressing, Mark. Yeah, keep it up. It's fantastic. Thank you all very much.